Welcome to this new automotive news video for Wednesday, March 4, 2026. Here's what's on the agenda. Today we're going to talk about the European Commission, which is working on a new tool to develop a special penalty. Electric car still on the topic of electric cars. We'll talk about the police who tried to get involved but gave up because of too many constraints. We'll also talk about the electric car giant BYD, which is experiencing an unprecedented crisis. Its car sales have almost been cut in half compared to 2025. We'll also talk about Stellantis, which is strengthening its partnership with its Chinese brand Lipmotor. But before all that, let me add another news item for you. Let me know in the comments if you think it's good news, bad news, or a bit of both. Remember last year in 2025, we talked a lot about a company called Northvolt. Northvolt was simply the #1 European electric car battery company. They had started building several gigafactories. They had already started delivering batteries to some brands, but things went wrong due to difficulties in ramping up production. But also because of Chinese companies, battery specialists who are able to offer electric car batteries that are much cheaper and sometimes even much more technologically advanced. Northvolt eventually went bankrupt. And that happened despite several billion euros in European subsidies that were made available to Northvolt to try to help them get back on track. The good news is that Northvolt is finally back. It has been bought out and battery production will resume. Northvolt is now aiming for a production of 16 gigawatt hours of batteries per year. That's enough to equip, let's say, 200,000 to 300,000 electric cars per year. The other good news is that Northvolt, to restart production, will hire 600 additional people at its European sites. The bad news is that the company that bought Northvolt to restart it is Lighton. And Lighton is absolutely not a European company, it's an American company. So yes, the #1 European battery maker is back, except that in the meantime, it has become American. By the way, just a small detail, you should know that Stellantis owns a small part of Lighton, just like it owns a part of ACC, which is another European electric battery manufacturer. And it is said, for now it's not officially confirmed, that Stellantis would like to source batteries from Northvolt to compensate for the delay caused by ACC, its other electric car battery company, struggling to increase production. This means that some vehicles, especially electric Peugeots, now have delivery times of about a year after ordering, which is obviously unacceptable for customers. Alright, now we're going to tackle the topics that were in the summary of this video. Of course, if you like this one, don't hesitate as usual to show it by leaving a like and subscribing for the next videos to boost this one to improve its ranking. And leave a comment where you share your opinion on today's news and updates. Today, there are plenty, since we're going to talk about the European Commission, which is currently looking into a new tool that could eventually be used to implement a European penalty on electric cars. The European Commission wants to expand the Ecolabel system that already exists in Europe and is used, for example, to classify household appliances according to their electricity consumption. Classifying homes, the famous DPE, which is a complete scam, but that's another topic. They want to extend this eco-label system to electric cars. The good news is the European Commission is finally recognizing the electric car as a household appliance. The bad news is that it's very likely a tool that will be used to introduce a new penalty specifically for electric cars. Here, the idea is to classify electric cars according to their energy consumption, just like with a washing machine, for example. Models that consume very little energy, for example, 14 kWh per 100 kilometers could get the highest rating, an A, while the most energy-hungry vehicles would fall into the lower categories. So, small city cars would be favored, while large, overpowered electric SUVs would be ranked lower. A system that should also consider the carbon footprint of vehicle and battery manufacturing, which means that it's entirely possible to find electric cars with extremely low consumption in a very poor category, if their battery comes from very far away, from China, for example. Just as you could find in the best categories vehicles that consume a lot, but whose battery is made locally, that is, in Europe. Interestingly, this would apply to both new and used vehicles. Both private individuals and professionals would have to consult a sort of European database that would allow them to obtain the certificate. The eco-label tag for the electric car you want to resell, kind of like a system of criteria, but generalized to electric cars. For now, we're not talking about additional taxes yet for models that have the lowest rankings. But this would be exactly the kind of tool needed to be able to implement them. Let's just hope that if the European Commission takes the step, in a few years, they decide to put some kind of penalty on electric cars based on their energy rating. It shouldn't happen too soon, because if it does before electric cars are mature in sales, it will just create another obstacle for European manufacturers, who are already struggling to convince customers. By the way, speaking of not being convinced by electric cars, let's talk about the police. In fact, in several European countries, the police are trying to switch to electric cars, and as in Austria, for example, it's not working. The police there tried electric cars for a few months, on a very small scale, with just a few electric vehicles provided for police services. And the conclusion of this study, this trial, is that for now, electric cars are far too restrictive for the police to be able to use them widely. 3 negative points came up. The first is range and charging times. Since indeed police cars are heavily modified compared to a standard vehicle, they are much heavier because they simply carry more electronic devices, as well as all the equipment needed for police intervention. And all this extra weight makes the energy consumption of electric cars skyrocket. So they simply need to be recharged too frequently. And the problem this causes is that police cars need to be available 24/7. If a crime is being committed, the police need to be able to leave immediately. But if the car hasn't finished charging, since charging isn't instant, it takes 20 to 30 minutes. Even with the models that have the most efficient batteries, that's simply unacceptable for a crime. To be responsive, the second problem that was brought up, and this is something we talk about much less. In France, we're not allowed to exceed 130 kilometers per hour. Electric cars are regularly limited in terms of top speed, like for example with Volkswagen, the ID range. On the ID3 and ID4 models, the speeds are limited to 160 kilometers per hour, a speed that isn't enough to be able to conduct high-speed chases, compared to combustion or hybrid vehicles that can easily exceed 200 kilometers per hour. And finally, the price. Since there are models that have actually proven to be more convincing, meaning they are sufficiently efficient and have acceptable charging times and ranges. For example, the Porsche Taycan. The problem is that an electric Porsche Taycan costs 80,000 euros plus several thousand euros more to equip it with all the systems needed for a police car. And that makes the final price 2 to 3 times higher than what you get with a hybrid or a combustion engine car. I also wanted to talk to you about BYD, the Chinese giant that's going through its first real major crisis. In 2025, BYD sold 4.5 million cars worldwide. That's huge. That was an increase of almost 7% compared to 2024. It was considered a strong, impressive result, but still below the group's expectations. And the results at the beginning of 2026 are even more concerning, since in January, global sales dropped by almost 30% compared to the same period the previous year. So we don't have the global figures for February 2026 yet, but if we look at what happened in China, which is still its main target market, sales in February 2026 dropped by 9% compared to January 2026, but more importantly, by 41% compared to February 2025. At BYD, they explain this drop in sales by 2 things. First, the Chinese New Year, which was celebrated this year from February 15th to 23rd. There's this festive period. Dealerships are often closed, factories run a bit slower. But that's not a very strong argument, since last year, in 2025, Chinese New Year was also during this period. BYD's second argument is the taxes imposed by the Chinese government on electric cars. These taxes, which were at 0% until now, have increased to 5%. That argument also seems rather unconvincing, since its competitors, like Geely, for example, managed to sell a bit more cars during this period than in February 2025. It's a 1% increase. Not huge, but compared to BYD's 40% drop, that's a big difference. To wrap up, let's discuss Stellantis and its Chinese brand Lipmotor, which is distributed in Europe and is part of the Stellantis group. By the way, it's leading in sales growth and seems central to Stellantis' strategy. Just a few days ago, we learned that this applies to its electric Peugeot, Citroën, or Fiat models. Stellantis has struggled to create a successful electric vehicle.
On serait en train de négocier avec Lipmotor pour pouvoir réutiliser
all-electric car tech, including motor and battery management. Today, we learn about a new partnership involving CO2 credits. Until now, Stellantis was buying CO2 credits from Tesla. Let me give you the short version of the CO2 credit story. When a manufacturer doesn't sell enough electric cars in Europe, they're exposed to fines related to their CO2 balance. Fines of several hundred million or even billions of euros. To avoid paying, they buy CO2 credits from another brand by merging records to lower their average CO2 and avoid fines.
Jusqu'ici, Stellantis prenait ceux de Tesla, mais on a...
That period is over. Stellantis now relies on its Chinese brand, Lipmotor, mainly an electric car seller for those famous CO2 credits. This will happen mainly through new Lipmotor production in Spain. With these cars now made in the EU, they'll face lower taxes, making them easier to sell. And Stellantis is counting on this new strategy, counting on these new sales to avoid the CO2 fines in 2026-2027. We already know that in Italy, for example, Lipmotor sales have generated enough CO2 credits to cancel out the potential fines that would have been owed by Fiat, which exceeded the European Commission's thresholds. Stellantis expects lower taxes will let it sell around 200,000 Lipmotor vehicles annually in Europe, which would allow it to avoid up to 2 billion in CO2 fines per year. Moreover, this is a hard blow for Tesla, because the sales of CO2 credits represented a significant part of its revenue. I don't want to say anything wrong, but I think that in 2023, it's almost half of its revenue. which means that from now on, Tesla will have to actively look for someone else to sell them to. That's it. We've covered the news for March 4th. I hope you found the video interesting. If that's the case, as usual, I'm counting on you to show it by leaving a like, subscribing for the next videos, and possibly supporting my channel through the join button below. I'll see you tomorrow for the next one. Bye.